I have held the Vethori transmission log in my hand, the actual file, on a physical chip pulled from the recovered relay buoy, and I want you to understand what it feels like before I tell you anything else. It feels like nothing. It is a data chip. It weighs 4 grams. The outer casing is a matte gray composite, slightly warm from the salvage team's handling, and it has a small serial imprint along one edge that I could not read because it was in a script I did not know. I carried it in my breast pocket for 6 hours before I turned it over to intelligence, and in those 6 hours I delivered 1 unit of plasma to a recovery diver with a suit puncture, sutured a 2-centimeter laceration on the hand of a salvage tech who had been careless with an airlock seal, administered a sedative to another tech who had found what we all eventually found in the cold sleep bays, 3 incident reports in the standard format. I did my job. The chip sat against my sternum the whole time. I am telling you this because people want to know what it was like. What I felt in those first hours at the debris field of the Aurelian passage, and the honest answer is that I felt the chip. I felt its 4 grams. I felt it every time I moved. My name is Yusuf Adara. I was a medic corporal assigned to the survey vessel, Karenyi, when we reached the Aurelian passage debris field on day 11 of the search and recovery operation. I was 31 years old. My sister Amara had boarded the Aurelian passage at Transit Hub Callisto 14 months and 9 days before our arrival, along with her husband Deo and their 2 daughters, Zara and Eve, 7 and 4. They were traveling in cold sleep to the Kepler 62 colony cluster, where Dio had a civil engineering contract, and Amara had an offer from the Colonial Medical Corps. I had helped them pack. I had driven them to the hub. I had watched the gate close. This is not a story about my grief. I want to be careful about that. My grief is mine, and it is not what happened to the Vethori Consolidate. What happened to the Vethori Consolidate is what this is about. The Aurelian Passage was a colony-class generation ship. 4 kilometers from bow to stern, modular cold sleep architecture housing 31,400 civilians in tiered suspension bays, with a skeleton crew of 220 navigators, engineers, and medical personnel, maintaining active watch rotation. She carried no weapons. She was not a military vessel. She was a city folded into a traveling frame, and every person aboard her was asleep when the Vethori gravity anchor field locked her in place 42 days into her transit. We did not know that then. Earth did not know it immediately. What Earth knew, 46 days into the transit, was that the Aurelian passage had missed a scheduled beacon ping, and that a follow-up signal, sent to her navigation console, had gone unanswered. Earth's communication protocols treat a missed beacon ping as a navigational anomaly, an emergency. Deep transit vessels experience sensor dropout, relay lag, and equipment faults as a matter of course. Earth sent a query. The Aurelian passage did not answer. Earth sent another. Earth opened a priority channel to the nearest relay station and received back a 17-hour signal lag, a Vethori Consolidate administrative transmission. The transmission was addressed to Earth's Colonial Transit Authority. It was logged by the authority's receiving bureau at 0341 on a Tuesday. I have read that transmission many times. I have it memorized. I will give you the substance of it, but I will not give you the exact language, because the exact language requires a kind of patience I do not fully have even now, years later. The substance was this. The Vethori Consolidate had, pursuant to Vethori Consolidate Territorial Code 7.4.1 subsection C, placed a navigational containment field around the vessel designated in Earth, cords as Aurelian Passage, on the grounds that the vessel's transit corridor passed within 0.03 astronomical units of a contested Vethori resource extraction zone. The containment would remain in effect pending resolution of the resource extraction dispute, specifically Earth's rejection of the Vethori Consolidate's prior proposal, submitted to Earth's Colonial Affairs Ministry 14 months earlier, that Earth cede exclusive mineral extraction rights to the Kadran Belt Transit Corridor in exchange for uncontested passage. The Vethori Consolidate expressed its continued interest in reaching a mutually productive resolution and noted that the transmission constituted formal notification as required under Vethori Consolidate Interstellar Transit Governance Protocol, Article 19. The transmission was signed by something that translated roughly as a Logistics Compliance Officer 3rd Tier, It was not signed by a general. It was not signed by an emperor or a council president or a war chief. It was signed by a logistics compliance officer, third tier. Because for the Vethori Consolidate, what they had done to the Aurelian Passage was not a military act. It was an administrative procedure. The vessel had passed through a disputed zone and had been logged as contained, the same way a cargo freighter might be logged as delayed at a customs inspection. The 31,400 people inside it were, in the Vethori's organizational framework, an entry in a field marked status, pending resolution. Earth answered within 4 hours of receiving the transmission. Earth's answer was clear. Release the vessel immediately. The Cadron Belt negotiations were a separate matter and would not be conducted under duress. Any harm to civilians aboard would be treated as an act of war. Earth's Secretary-General transmitted the response personally, which was not standard procedure, which was itself a signal. The Vethori Consolidate received Earth's response, logged it, and filed it. I want to be precise about this. They filed it into their administrative system under the Aurelian Passage's containment record. Response. The Secretary-General's personal transmission, warning of war, was logged as received, non-binding counterproposal, pending review, and then they did nothing. Earth sent 17 more transmissions over the following 14 months. They were all logged. They were all filed. Several of them received auto-responses, referencing the original containment notice and the unresolved resource dispute. One of them received a response from what translated as a senior logistics compliance officer, second tier, who noted that Earth's position had been reviewed and that the Consolidate remained open to productive dialogue. The vessel's status in the Vethori system remained containment active, pending resolution. The Aurelian Passage's life support systems were not designed to run for 14 months with no external resupply and no active crew intervention on cold sleep arrays. The cold sleep arrays required a maintenance cycle every 90 days, a physical cycle, not a remote one, requiring a technician to physically access each bay's environmental regulator and perform a calibration sequence. The skeleton crew ran their first cycle at day 90. They ran their second cycle, partially at day 170, at which point their own supplies were critically depleted and 4 crew members had died of conditions unrelated to the crisis. Could not run a third cycle. The cold sleep bays began to fail in sequence, from the aft sections forward. The process was not violent. It was very quiet. The suspension fields weakened, and the people inside them did not wake. Their metabolisms were too suppressed for that. They simply stopped, bay by bay, deck by deck, in the order in which the regulators lost calibration. 31,400 people who had gone to sleep, thinking they were going to a new world. Vethori system logged the Aurelian Passage's final beacon silence on month 14, day 6. The entry read, Containment concluded, vessel non-responsive, status updated, closed. The resource dispute remained open. There was a notation at the bottom of the closure entry, in what translated as an administrative remarks field, that the Vethori Consolidate continued to express interest in dialogue regarding the Cadron Belt corridor. We found the Aurelian Passage 12 days after Earth received a copy of that closure notification, transmitted, with the same bureaucratic courtesy as everything else, to Earth's Colonial Transit Authority for their records. I was not supposed to be on the Karenyi. I was assigned to a garrison medical station at Titan Base, and I had requested emergency reassignment when the passage was first reported missing, and the request had been denied twice on grounds of non-essential personnel deployment. And I had requested a third time after the Vethori transmission arrived, and been denied again. I was reassigned 6 days before the Karenyi departed, not because anyone reconsidered my request, but because the medic originally assigned had developed a respiratory infection, and I was the nearest qualified replacement with current deep transit certification. I do not know how to characterize that. I have stopped trying. The debris field was not what I had expected, which tells you something about what I had been imagining. I think I had imagined something violent, breached hull, scattered sections, the evidence of a rupture. The Aurelian Passage was mostly intact. The gravity anchor field had held her in place, and then simply been switched off. When the Vethori logged the file closed, She had continued her transit dead and dark until she was no longer moving under her own inertia and began to drift. The hull was whole. The cold sleep bays were intact. What was not intact was anything inside them. The salvage teams worked in 2-hour shifts, because that was the maximum recommended exposure for that kind of work. I treated 11 cases of acute stress response in the first 48 hours, 4 in the next 24, and then the numbers leveled off, not because people were coping better, but because the ones who were going to break had broken, and the ones who had not broken had found whatever it was inside themselves that let them keep working. I was one of the latter. I do not know why. I looked at and I kept writing my incident reports. And I kept the Vethori relay chip in my breast pocket, and I did not break. And I am not proud of that the way some people seem to think I should be. I am simply telling you what happened. I found my sister on day 4. Recovery teams were methodical. They worked section by section, bay by bay, logging each individual in the suspension records against the passenger manifest and confirming disposition. I had memorized Amara's bay number from the boarding documentation I had helped her file. I went to that bay on my off shift on day 4, which was technically a violation of the operational protocols restricting personnel from recovery sections outside their assigned duties, and no one stopped me, possibly because they all knew, possibly because the protocols were not being enforced with any rigor at that point. The bay was cold, and the emergency lighting was amber, and the suspension units were all open, because the recovery teams had already passed through. I want to tell you it was peaceful, but I don't know that it was. It looked like sleep. That is what I can say. All 4 of them, Amara and Dio and Zara and Eve, looked like sleep. I stood there for what I was later told was 45 minutes, though I remember only about 10. Then I went back to the medical bay, and I wrote my incident reports, and I administered a broad-spectrum antibiotic to a salvage tech with a sinus infection, and I held the relay chip in my hands for a while before I turned it over to intelligence. What I felt, holding that chip, was not what most people expect when I describe this moment. I was not feeling grief, exactly. I had felt grief in the bay, those 45 minutes that felt like 10. What I felt holding the chip was something quieter and more durable than grief. It was more like understanding. The Vethori Consolidate had done this with a form. They had done it with a filing system. They had killed 31,400 people, my sister, her husband, her daughters, 26,000 other families worth of the same, by declining to update a record. They had not decided to commit an atrocity. They had decided to enforce a policy, and the atrocity had been the arithmetic consequence of the policy, logged and filed and closed. I understood then that it would have to be answered in kind. I do not mean that loosely. I mean it exactly. The answer to the Vethori Consolidate could not be grief. It could not be rage, which would have satisfied something in me, but would not have carried the weight of what they had done. What they had done was bureaucratic, patient, and absolutely final. The answer had to be all 3 of those things. It had to be conducted with the same cool administrative precision at a scale that would make their filing system irrelevant, and it had to be just as final. Not because I wanted it that way, because that was what the math required. I turned in the chip. I wrote my reports. I requested reassignment to the Ardent Severance program 6 days after we returned to Titan Base, having read the initial mission briefing that had been circulated to medical personnel with appropriate clearance. The briefing described a planned military response to the Aurelian passage incident. It used language I found at the time almost too measured. Language about objectives and timelines and force composition, language that gave me no sense of the actual scale of what was being planned. I requested reassignment because I wanted to be there, wherever there turned out to be. I was approved in 11 days. The Ardent Severance program had been running for 3 weeks by the time I joined it. There were people I knew at Titan Base who had tried to talk me out of the reassignment request. Not unkindly, they were thinking of my welfare, what they understood of it. They said it would be too close. They said being near the operation would not help me grieve. I told them that I was not trying to grieve. I was trying to be present at whatever happened next, and that those were different things, and that I had already made the decision. They did not push further. The request was filed, approved, And the next phase of my life began, with a security briefing in a room, with no windows at Titan Base's restricted administrative wing, followed by a medical certification review, followed by 17 forms. I will try to describe what the program was, because I think people miss large-scale military preparations, the way they misunderstand most things that happen slowly. They imagine a decision, someone in a room slamming a hand on a table, an order issued, ships scrambling from their berths in a surge of purpose, and they imagine it happening all at once, over hours or days. The Ardent Severance program did not work that way. What it looked like from inside was paperwork, not metaphorical paperwork, actual administrative process, requisition forms for hull components, crew assignment manifests, supply chain coordination across 6 different shipyard complexes, medical personnel certification reviews. I spent my first 3 weeks at the program, reviewing immunization records for crew members assigned to vessels in the 3rd Battle Group. Is not a romantic way to describe preparation for war, but it is an accurate one. The romance came later. What came first was the work. The Ardent's Severance fleet was built around a core of 510 warships, a number that had been determined not by how many ships Earth had available but by how many ships Earth calculated. It needed to ensure that no portion of the operation would fail for want of firepower. Every contingency had been accounted for. Every contingency had been staffed. There was a medical team assigned to each vessel, the Ashraf Coordination Center aboard the flagship that I was assigned to on month 7 of the program, at which point I had been promoted to senior medic and given responsibility for coordinating medical response across 17 ships in the 4th Battle Group. I was not chosen for this because of my personal connection to the Aurelian passage. I was chosen because I had the qualifications and the clearance, and I had asked to be there, and in the Ardent Severance program, those 3 things together were sufficient. The program's technical centerpiece was some things that none of the public briefings released in subsequent years have fully described, and I am going to describe it here because I was present for the testing phase, and because I think it is the part of the story that deserves the most careful attention. The Vethori consolidates gravity anchor field. The technology they had used to lock the Aurelian passage in place was not, turned out, a particularly exotic piece of engineering. It was sophisticated, but not in ways that were beyond Earth's reverse engineering capability. Given in enough time and enough of the right personnel, the Irini survey teams had recovered components of the relay buoy that had maintained the anchor field during the containment period, and those components had been transferred to a classified research installation at Europa Station. Within weeks of the salvage operation concluding, team there, I never met most of them. I know their work through its results, spent 21 months pulling the technology apart and understanding it, and then they spent another 6 months building a version of it that Earth could deploy at scale. The Vethori anchor field worked by projecting a gravitational interference pattern at a vessel's drive manifolds, disrupting the manifold's ability to generate directional thrust. It was, at its core, an elegant mechanism. No need to match the target vessel's speed or position. No need for a physical tether. You broadcast the interference pattern on the correct frequency, and the vessel simply could not go anywhere. The Europa team's adaptation was different in one important way. The original Vethori field was designed to anchor a single civilian vessel. Earth's version was designed to anchor a planetary orbital installation. Specifically, the Vethori consolidates primary orbital processing ring, a structure approximately 300 kilometers in diameter that housed the consolidate's main administrative centers, their primary communications infrastructure, and somewhere between 80 and 90,000 Vethori personnel. The orbital ring was, in the consolidate's infrastructure, what the Colonial Transit Authority's Administrative Bureau was in Earth's. It was where the filing happened. I watched the first full-scale test of the adapted anchor system from the Europa Station Observation Bay, standing next to the program's chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Celeste Harrow, who had been a trauma surgeon before she was a military officer and who had a habit of standing with her arms crossed and her eyes very still that I found both calming and slightly unnerving. test was announced on the engineering schedule as a routine propulsion systems evaluation, which was technically accurate in the same way that saying the Aurelian passage incident had been a navigational matter was technically accurate. We watched an unmanned test vessel the size of a medium transport get locked in place by the adapted field, and then we watched it held there for 6 hours, while the field maintained its projection with no degradation. Dr. Harrow uncrossed her arms and wrote something on her clipboard and said, quietly, that she supposed that answered that. I agreed that it did. I want to say something about the people I served with during those 4 years of the Ardent Severance program, because the accounts I have read since tend to reduce the preparation period to a sequence of technical milestones. The anchor adaptation, fleet commissioning, the departure authorization, and lose the texture of what it was like to live inside it. It was not heroic in the way stories make it heroic. It was long and granular and, for most of us, marked by a persistent undercurrent of something that was not quite grief and not quite anger and not quite purpose, but some compound of all three that had no good name. We talked about the Aurelian passage the way soldiers talk about the thing that brought them there, obliquely, in references, in small remarks that acknowledged it without dwelling in it. Nobody gave speeches. Nobody wept at briefings. What we did was work, and the work was very specific, and the specificity of it was, I think, the thing that held most of us together. I knew, by month 8 of the program, a navigator named Corporal Adamu Weiss, who had lost a cousin on the passage and who played cards with obsessive precision, and who had a rule that he would not discuss anything that happened before the program began. I knew an engineer, a war officer named COG1, who had survived the passage's departure because she had missed her berth by 11 hours due to equipment malfunction at Hub Callisto that had delayed her connecting shuttle, and who carried that 11-hour margin the way you carry something you have not earned and cannot put down. I knew Dr. Harrow, who had not lost anyone on the passage and who had been selected for the program on the strength of her qualifications alone, and who was therefore in some ways the clearest-eyed person I served with, and whose clarity I leaned on more than she knew. These were the people of the Ardent Severance program. They were not symbols. They were people doing a job that needed doing, with the weight of it distributed differently across each of them. I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that there are people who read accounts like this one and object to the coldness of them, want me to tell them that we struggled with what we were doing, that we questioned whether the scale of the response was just, that we lay awake in the small hours of the program arguing ethics. I will tell you honestly, we did not struggle with it. We had 400 reasons not to, and every one of us had read the transmission logs. The Vethori Consolidate had been given 14 months and 17 transmissions. They had filed all of them. We gave them 4 years of preparation, and we felt, in preparing, something that I can only describe as exactness. The response had a shape, and the shape was correct, and we were building it. That was what the 4 years felt like, not war fever. Exactness. We departed on a Thursday. I remember this specifically because I had a shift briefing at 0600, and the departure window opened at 0900, and I spent the 3 hours between them doing an inventory of the trauma center's blood product stores, which needed to be done regardless of the schedule, and which I was not going to leave undone because we happened to be about to cross 12 light years. The blood products were at full capacity. The inventory was clean. I filed the report at 0847 and went to the observation deck for the last 11 minutes before the drive engaged, because I had any particular attachment to the view of Europa Station dwindling behind us, but because Dr. Harrow had suggested it, and she had generally been right about such things. The fleet arrayed around us in formation, 510 ships, their hulls catching the sun off Europa's ice, running lights in precise intervals, the whole structure of the thing visible, in a way, that it would not be once we were in transit. And I watched it for 11 minutes and thought about blood product inventory and did not think about anything else. Then the drive engaged and the view ended, and I went back to work. The transit took 19 days. I treated 14 cases of transit nausea, 2 stress-related cardiac events that were both resolved without permanent complication, one case of appendicitis that required surgical intervention, and approximately 30 cases of insomnia, presenting as a request for sedatives that I declined to fill on the first visit and referred to the program's psychological support staff per protocol. The psychological support staff were, in my assessment, amongst the most important people in the program, and among the least discussed in subsequent accounts, which I find frustrating. They held a great deal. We came out of transit at the edge of the Vethori home system on a Tuesday morning, ship time, and I was in the trauma center doing a supply check when the general alert sounded, and the flagship's navigator's voice came over the ship-wide channel announcing our arrival. The announcement was brief and factual. I finished my supply check. Then I went to the observation bay, because I wanted to see what we had come to. The Vethori homeworld was larger than Earth, about 40% more massive, with a dense lower atmosphere, and 3 moons in close orbit that gave it a ringed appearance from the approach angle we were using. The orbital processing ring was visible, even at this distance, a dark band against the planet's amber-blue cloud cover, enormous and self-contained, and, I realized as I looked at it, arranged very similarly in function and position to Earth's own orbital administrative stations. I had known this from the briefings. Seeing it was different from knowing it. It had a kind of physical realness to it that briefing documents cannot convey. The scale of it, the weight of what it represented, the 80-some thousand leaves inside it going about their administrative work on what was, for them, a perfectly ordinary day. I did not feel sympathy. But I noted the realness of it, because it mattered that the thing we were responding to was real, that the weight was real on both sides. The Aurelian passage had been real. This was real. Everything from here would be real. I watched the ring for about 10 minutes. Then I went back to the supply check. I used those 4 hours productively. I ran a full review of the trauma center's surgical kit inventory, which I had already done twice in transit, but which benefited from doing again. The surgical kits were complete. I wrote a brief to the 4th Battle Group's medical leads about post-action protocol. I ate a meal in the crew mess and drank 2 cups of coffee, and did not think about my sister or her daughters, because I had said what I needed to say to them in my own private way during the 4 years of preparation and the 19 days of transit, and there was nothing left to say. I had given that grief everything I had, and now I had nothing for it, and the nothing was not emptiness. It was something else. The thing that comes after grief is fully spent, which is a kind of readiness that has no particular emotion attached to it. At hour 4, the flagship's captain authorized the first transmission. This is the part I want you to understand clearly, because it is the part that is most often described incorrectly. The Ardent Severance fleet did not arrive firing. We were not in combat posture in those first hours. What we did for first was transmit. The transmission went to the Vethori Consolidate's Administrative Communications Center, the primary receiver node of their orbital processing ring, and it was formatted in the Vethori Consolidate's own administrative transmission protocol, which the communications team had spent considerable time learning, because the format mattered. The substance of the transmission was this: the United Earth Colonial Authority, acting under Emergency Resolution 74, 1 Section C, the same article the Vethori Consolidate had cited in their original containment notice, had placed a navigational containment field around the vessel designated in Vethori records as Orbital Processing Ring Kethavar Prime. The containment would remain in effect pending resolution of the incident, designated in Earth records as Aurelian Passage Case File 001. The field would be maintained for a period of 14 months from the date of this transmission, corresponding to the duration of the containment applied by the Vethori Consolidate to the Aurelian Passage. Earth expressed its continued interest in an appropriate resolution. The transmission constituted formal notification as required under United Earth Emergency Governance Protocol, Article 1. It was signed Earth Secretary General. I was not on the bridge. I received a text notification on my tablet, the way I received all non-medical information during the operation, a brief summary, timestamp, status. I read it. I set the tablet down. I went back to the surgical kit inventory. The anchor field engaged 15 minutes after the transmission. I did not feel it from inside the flagship. We were not within the field's projection radius. The field was targeted at the Vethori orbital ring, not at us. What I was told later by the navigation officer who ran the deployment was that the ring's drive stabilizers had been active. The ring maintained its orbital position through a constant low-level thrust correction, the way large orbital structures do, and that when the anchor field engaged, those stabilizers had gone silent. The ring had not moved. It had simply stopped being able to move. Containment active. The Vethori response came quickly. I will give the Consolidate that. Their administrative response time when the situation was immediate and personal rather than removed and bureaucratic was considerably faster than 14 months. We received 17 transmissions in the first 6 hours after the anchor field engaged. The first 5 were demand transmissions. Disengage the field immediately. This action was illegal under interstellar transit law. The Consolidate reserved the right to respond with full force. The 6th was a communication from something that translated as a senior compliance director, first tier, who noted that the situation was being escalated to higher administrative review. The 7th was from what appeared to be a governing council, demanding Earth's fleet stand down and requesting to speak with a commanding officer. All 17 transmissions were logged by Earth's communications team. They were filed. A single auto-response was generated for each, formatted in the Vethori's own administrative protocol, referencing the original containment notice and citing the unresolved status of Aurelian. Passage Case File 001. Status, containment active, pending resolution. I know it is not my place to say whether that was justice. I have my own view, which is that it was the only possible correspondence. Not because I believe in the poetry of reciprocity, though there is something in that, because the Vethori Consolidate's offense, if had been specifically administrative, it had been the violence of forms, of non-binding counterproposals, of files logged and closed. The answer had to be in the same language, at a scale that made the language into something they could not ignore or file away. We were not answering cruelty with cruelty. We were answering bureaucracy with bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy we had built was 510 warships and a gravity anchor field around their orbital ring. The first 2 weeks of the containment were, for me, medically uncomplicated. The fleet maintained position at the system edge, the anchor field held without degradation, and the Vethori transmissions continued, escalating in administrative seniority with each passing week. Day 10, we were receiving transmissions from something that translated as the Consolidate's primary governing board. By day 14, they had transmitted 48 times. Earth's communications team had filed all 48 transmissions and generated responses for each. The field held. I treated the injuries and illnesses that come with a large fleet on extended position hold. 2 more cases of transit nausea that had been slow to resolve. 1 fracture from a maintenance accident in the engine bay of a frigate in the 2nd battle group. A recurrence of the cardiac patient's arrhythmia that required medication adjustment. Various infections and musculoskeletal complaints. I reviewed my battle group's medical readiness reports. I ran drills. I ran the drills again. Day 22, the Vethori Consolidate attempted to use their own naval vessels to disrupt the anchor field projection. I learned about this from a text notification that told me to prepare the trauma center for potential casualties, and that fleet engagement was authorized if Vethori naval vessels approached within a defined exclusion radius. I prepared the trauma center. 3 Vethori vessels approached to within 60% of the exclusion radius, and then held. They did not cross it. Our fleet's formation had responded to their approach by shifting into a configuration that made very clear what crossing the radius would result in, and the Vethori vessels held where they were for 9 hours before withdrawing to a position outside sensor range. Trauma Center received no casualties. I have been asked many times what I was thinking during those weeks of the containment. I have given various answers, depending on who was asking and what kind of answer they were looking for. The honest answer is that mostly I was thinking about medical inventory and drill schedules and the cardiac patient's arrhythmia and whether the 4th Battle Group's surgical kits had enough of a particular clotting agent that we were running low on. These are the things I was thinking about, because these were the things that required thinking about. The thing that sat underneath all of it, the weight that I had carried since the debris field, and the relay chip and the amber, light in Bay 7 of the cold sleep deck, that thing did not require thought. It was simply there, quiet and durable, the way a load-bearing structure is there. You do not think about it. It holds. Month 3 of the containment, the Vethori began to request formal diplomatic contact. Not demand it, request it. The shift in register was documented in the communications team's logs with a single notation. Change in protocol. They had begun addressing Earth's communications team directly, rather than addressing the field, and the transmissions had begun, including what translated as a formal request for mediated dialogue, acknowledging that the situation required resolution and expressing the Consolidate's readiness to engage in good faith. For Earth received and logged each of these transmissions. Earth filed them. Earth's single auto-response noted that the unresolved status of Aurelian Passage, Case File 001, remained unchanged and that the containment would remain in effect per the terms of the original notification. Status, pending resolution. I want to be very precise about something here, because I have heard accounts that make this part of the story into something it was not. Earth was not enjoying this. The command team was not, so far as I could observe, deriving satisfaction from the Vethori's mounting transmissions. They were executing a protocol. Protocol had been designed with care over 4 years by people who had read every word of the Vethori's administrative response to the Aurelian Passage and had understood exactly what they were responding to. The protocol said, 14 months, the same as they gave us, logged and filed in the same format, answered with the same language. The protocol did not include a section for satisfaction. It included a section for medical readiness in the event of combat, which I maintained, and a section for communications response, which the communications team maintained, and a section for field integrity monitoring, which the engineering teams maintained. Month 5, a Vethori transmission arrived, that the communications team flagged for the captain's direct attention, rather than processing through the auto-response system. I heard about this from Dr. Harrow, who had been in the command briefing. The transmission was from the Consolidate's primary governing board, and it constituted a formal acknowledgement, in the Consolidate's own administrative language, filed through our own protocol, that the containment of the Aurelian Passage had resulted in the deaths of all 400 persons aboard, that this outcome had not been intended by the Consolidate, and that the Consolidate was prepared to enter negotiations regarding reparation, accountability, and the permanent status of the Kydran Belt Corridor. The transmission used the word concluded in reference to the Aurelian Passage incident. It was the same word they had used in the original closure entry. Containment concluded. The captain filed the transmission. The auto-response went out. Status pending resolution. Dr. Harrow told me this in the mess, over coffee, the same stillness in her eyes that she always had. She did not editorialize. She said the captain had made the call, and the protocol had been followed, and we were on month 5. I said I suppose that was right. She said she supposed it was. We finished our coffee and went back to work. I will not walk you through every remaining month in this detail. The Vethori transmissions continued and escalated. By month 8, there were factions within the Consolidate's own administrative structure that were transmitting separately, units or departments, or something analogous to ministries, each with their own routing codes and their own requests for resolution. Some frantic and some measured, received and logged and filed all of them. The field held. Month 10. The Vethori naval vessels returned and attempted the exclusion radius again, this time from 3 directions simultaneously. The 3rd battle group engaged 2 of the vessels in a brief action that resulted in those vessels withdrawing at high speed, one of them with visible drive damage. 3 personnel in the 3rd battle group sustained minor injuries in the action. 1 burn, 1 sprain from an impact during evasive maneuver, 1's laceration. I treated the laceration myself. The burn and the sprain were handled by the 3rd group's own medical team. None of the 3 were serious. Month 12, the Vethori Consolidate's governing board transmitted a formal apology. It was in their own administrative language, in their own protocol, logged with a formal seal that the communications team identified as corresponding to a maximum authority administrative action, the equivalent, in their system, of a direct governing board decree. The apology acknowledged the Aurelian passage as an unlawful act. It used the word unlawful in the Vethori administrative sense, which the translation team noted carried a stronger weight in Vethori governance language than it might imply in Earth's. It was the word used for actions that violated the Consolidate's own core protocols, not merely Earth's standards. The apology proposed immediate release of the anchor field, a negotiated reparation schedule, and the permanent withdrawal of the Cadron Belt resource claim. The captain received the transmission. The captain logged it. The auto-response went out. Status: pending resolution. 14 months from the date of the original notification. Day 422, ship time. I want to tell you what month 13 was like, but there is not much to tell. The Vethori had stopped transmitting demands. They had submitted, in total, 206 transmissions over the containment period, and Earth had logged and filed everyone. The rate of incoming transmissions had dropped off sharply after the formal apology. I think, though I cannot know this, that the Consolidate had run out of higher authorities to escalate to and out of new things to say. A few transmissions still came in, spaced days apart, each one a variant of the apology and the proposal. They were logged and filed. The field held. I spent month 13 doing what I had spent every other month doing: medical inventory, drill schedules. The cardiac patient's arrhythmia had stabilized on the adjusted medication, and I was down classifying his case to routine monitoring. I had a tech in the second battle group with a vitamin D deficiency from the transit that I was managing with supplementation. These were my concerns. These and the steady rhythm of the trauma center and the quiet of the flagship in the long rotation between incident and incident. On day 422, I was in the trauma center when the notification came through. Not an alert. A standard text notification, the kind that came through for supply updates and roster changes. It said, containment period concluded. Field disengagement authorized per protocol. Ardent severance resolution phase initiated. I read it twice. Then I set down the tablet and went to the observation bay. The anchor field disengaged at 13:47 hours, ship time. The Vethori orbital ring, Kethavar Prime, 80-some thousand Vethori personnel, the administrative core of the Consolidate, was released. The ring's own drive stabilizers came back online. Not see them. From the observation bay, not at this distance, but the fleet's sensors showed it in the navigation display on the bay's secondary screen, and I watched the signal indicate that the ring had resumed its orbital corrections. Containment concluded. Then the fleet moved. I want to be careful again about how I describe this. The Ardent Severance fleet was not a vengeance fleet in the way that word implies. It did not rampage. It did not scatter across the Vethori system firing at whatever it could reach. 510 ships moved in formation, precise and pre-planned sequence, and what they did was systematic. The orbital ring was not targeted. The civilian population centers on the homeworld surface were not targeted. What was targeted was the Vethori Consolidate's naval infrastructure, the shipyards, the orbital weapons platforms, the fleet anchorages, the military communications relays. The targeting package had been built over 4 years. Every asset was mapped. Every engagement was sequenced. The ships knew where to go and what to do when they got there. I know the numbers from the after-action records. I will give them to you plainly. The Vethori Consolidate's naval infrastructure was reduced by 94% in 11 hours of continuous engagement. The shipyards were gone. The weapons platforms were gone. The fleet anchorages were destroyed where they were berthed. The Vethori ships that had been home-ported there going with them. Those ships that had twice probed our exclusion radius and withdrawn. Portion of the Vethori naval assets attempted coordinated resistance, and that resistance was met with force sufficient to conclude it. And in one case, a Vethori vessel achieved a firing solution on a frigate in the second battle group, and damaged her engine section before being destroyed. The frigate was recoverable. 7 crew members were wounded, 2 of them seriously. Both of the serious cases were stabilized in surgery aboard the frigate's own medical bay and transferred to the flagship's trauma center for post operative care. Those two were my responsibility from the moment they arrived. A navigation specialist, female, mid-30s, shrapnel to the upper left quadrant from a hull fragment, a drive engineer, male, older, concussive blast injury, and a ruptured eardrum that masked a more serious intracranial bleed that his own ship's medics had not had the imaging equipment to detect. I found the bleed on first scan. We took him into surgery within 20 minutes of transfer. He survived. I wrote that in his chart in the same flat notation I used for every entry. The specialist recovered without further complication. Oh, Foth, the same I told all my surgical cases when they were awake enough to hear it. You are stable and the fleet is intact. These were the facts that mattered. I was in the trauma center from 1600 through the following morning. I remember it the way you remember any long surgical period. In narrow focus, all detail, no sense of time. At hour 11, the Ardent Severance fleet ceased active engagement and moved to a high-orbit position above the Vethori homeworld. The Vethori Consolidate had transmitted 41 times during the 11 hours of engagement, most of them distress-coded communications that Earth's team had logged without response. At 0611 the following morning, Earth's communications team transmitted a final notification to the Consolidate's governing board, formatted in the Vethori's administrative protocol, noting that Ardent Severance resolution phase had concluded and that the terms of resolution, permanent withdrawal of the Cadron Belt resource, claim, a reparation schedule for the Aurelian passage incident, and a permanent demilitarized corridor for Earth colonial transit, were transmitted, herewith, and required acknowledgement within 30 days. The transmission noted that Earth's fleet would maintain its current orbital position pending that acknowledgement. The transmission was signed by the Secretary General. The Vethori Consolidate's governing board acknowledged within 19 hours. The acknowledgement was in their formal maximum authority administrative protocol, and it accepted all three terms without modification. The communications team logged it. The fleet began withdrawing from high orbit the following morning. I was present for none of the formal communications, of course. I was in the trauma center. My 2 serious surgical cases were stable and progressing. I had 7 additional crew members from the various battle groups who had been transferred for level of care I could provide that their own ships not, and I was managing those cases and supervising 3 medics who were, I thought, exhausted enough to make errors if not watched. We managed. The work was specific and I was specific with it. I was at the trauma center window, a small porthole more than a window, square, looking out to the starboard side of the flagship. When I became aware that the fleet was moving, I could see it in the way the formation's lights changed angle and spacing very slowly over the course of about 2 hours. The Vethori homeworld was not visible from where I stood, but I knew it was there, behind us now the amber blue of its atmosphere receding. I watched the lights of the fleet adjust their geometry for some minutes. Then, one of my post-surgical patients called for pain management and I went back to work. I have been asked, in the years since, whether I believe what we did was right. I have given various answers. The honest answer, the one I will give you now, because this account has no further room for diplomatic phrasing, is that I do not frame it as right or wrong. I frame it as correspondence. The Vethori Consolidate applied a bureaucratic procedure to 31,400 living people and filed the results when the procedure concluded. Earth applied a bureaucratic procedure to the Vethori Consolidate's naval infrastructure and filed the results when the procedure concluded. The procedures were in the same administrative language. The second procedure was larger because it had to be. The asymmetry was the message. My sister Amara was 29 when she boarded the Aurelian passage. Her daughters Zara and Ife were 7 and 4. I do not know what Zara would have been as an adult, or Ife, or what kind of work they would have done on the Kepler 62 colony, or whether they would have been anything like their mother, who was precise and funny, and had a habit of knowing the right thing to say before you had finished asking the question. I know only what they were when I last saw them. 7 and 4 in a cold sleep bay with amber emergency lighting, looking like sleep. The Ardent Severance fleet completed its transit home without incident. The Vethori Consolidate's reparation schedule was agreed to in full within the 30-day window. The Cadron Belt Corridor was formally demilitarized 6 months later, in a ceremony that I did not attend because I was on duty. The resolution accords were signed by the Secretary General and by the Vethori Consolidates Governing Board in a joint administrative filing that I believe broke some kind of record for the length of the formal protocol header. Both documents were logged. Both were filed. I completed my assignment with the Ardent Severance program on the day the fleet docked at Titan Base and was formally stood down. I returned to garrison medical duty the following week. Within a month, I was treating transit nausea and sinus infections and stress-related insomnia, the same as before, and the rhythm of the work was the same as it had always been. Specific, clean, one patient at a time. I keep a copy of the original Vethori transmission log, not the chip itself, which I turned over to intelligence, and which is presumably filed somewhere in a records archive, but a printed transcript, which I requested through formal channels and received in a standard manila envelope with a bureaucratic routing stamp on the outside. I have it in a drawer. I do not read it often. When I do, I read it to the end, including the closure entry. Attainment concluded. Vessel non-responsive. Status updated closed. Below that entry, someone in Earth's records archive has added a single supplemental notation. Date stamped 4 years and 8 months after the original closure. It reads Aurelian Passage Case File 01. Resolution concluded. Status updated. Closed. I think about my sister when I read that. I think about her and Dio and Zara and Ife, and about the 26,000 other families worth of the same, and about the cold sleep bay and the amber light and the 45 minutes that felt like 10. And then I close the drawer, because there is nothing left to file. The record is complete. The correspondence is done. That is what happened.